Good evening. Thank you for being with us. My name is Shannon Keller. I'm the Helen Bernstein Librarian for Periodicals and Journals, and I'm here to introduce tonight's conversation with this year's winner of the Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism, Rachel Louise Snyder, for her book, No Visible Bruises: What We Don't Know About Domestic Violence Can Kill Us. The Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism is an annual prize given to journalists whose books bring clarity and public attention to important issues, events, and policies. Each year, 5 finalists for the Bernstein Book Award are selected by a library review committee comprised of staff across the New York Public Library. This year, the Library Review Committee read close to 100 books before choosing the finalists. Winners are chosen from the 5 finalists by the Bernstein Selection Committee, composed of professional journalists. The Helen Bernstein Book Award for Excellence in Journalism was established in 1987 through a gift from Joseph Frank Bernstein in honor of Helen Bernstein Feely. Both the Library Review Committee and the Selection Committee lauded Rachel's compelling narrative prowess to educate, enlighten, and expose readers about the far-reaching societal effects of domestic violence. Through Rachel's reporting, we all learned about the challenges we face and the actionable changes we can take in intervening and preventing domestic violence. If you haven't already, you can purchase Rachel's book through the library's shop. Just go to nypl.org/shop. Tonight, Rachel will be speaking with Tali Farhadian Weinstein. Tali is a prosecutor, a teacher, and an advocate for criminal justice reform. Before taking her current position as general counsel in the district's office in Brooklyn, Tali clerked for Justice Sandra Day O'Connor at the Supreme Court and the Honorable Merrick B. Garland at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit. She has also served in the U.S. Department of Justice from 2009 to 2017 as an Assistant United States Attorney of the Eastern District of New York and as counsel to the Attorney General of the United States. We couldn't be more thrilled to have Tali with us. Before I invite both Rachel and Tali on, just a couple of quick notes. This event is being simulcast on Zoom and YouTube. If you're in the Zoom event, please note that it is being recorded, but not you, only the event itself, which is to say myself and Tali and Rachel. Also, Rachel will be glad to answer some of your questions at the end of the conversation. You can send them anytime by typing them into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the Zoom app. We'll make sure that Rachel sees them, though she may not have time to answer everything. Okay, please welcome Tali Weinstein and this year's winner of the Helen Bernstein Book Award, Rachel Louise Snyder.
Good evening.
Good evening. I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you so much for being here, Rachel, with us here at the New York Public Library, so to speak, and congratulations on the Helen Bernstein Award.
Thank you.
Let's get right into it. So Rachel, this is such an extraordinary book. Thank you for writing it. And your subject, of course, is domestic violence, but one of the lessons of your book is that domestic violence intersects with so many other kinds of violence, and indeed with so many societal problems. And so taking that as our launching off point, I couldn't help but start this conversation with what's been going on across the country, especially in the last week and a half, protesters in the street, protesting against police violence, and then sometimes being met with police violence. And you say in your book that law enforcement has its own troubled relationship to domestic violence. You cite the statistic that domestic violence is 2 to 4 times more likely to occur in a police family, meaning the police officer is the perpetrator of the domestic violence, than in the average population. So I want to start by asking you about that. What should we make of the fact that police officers are so much more likely to commit domestic violence at home? And to put the question slightly differently, if we did policing differently, do you think that there would be less domestic violence inside police homes?
Well, that's it's an interesting question because, of course, we never know corollaries and causation until we actually try something, right? So I want to sort of answer that two ways. I mean, the first way I tweeted when all the protests started happening, and the thing I said was like, let's do a Venn diagram of the police who beat their spouses, and the police who beat people of color, and the police who keep those two groups from real accountability. And somewhere in there, you will find where I think the root of the problem is, right? Or at least the beginning of the problem. Yeah, I mean, domestic violence is rampant in police forces. I have seen videos myself where the police are called to a home and they arrive and it's their coworker, it's their buddy, and they sort of give them up, come on, man, just calm down, right? But there's no accountability. And I think accountability within the police force is one of the real problems. And it's one of the things I think the protesters are really trying to demand, that police no longer have immunity. And I just absolutely fully support that. But I also would include with that some addressing of domestic violence in terms of their immunity. The other part of your question about would we see rates of domestic violence go down? I mean, I think so. But I also think that we need a lot, just as we do with people of color and police violence. We need a lot of different community organizations and community groups to be involved in solving this. It can't just be law enforcement and the judiciary. I didn't mean to interrupt you, but the thing is, what I keep saying to people is the difference between like the protests that we're seeing now is that so much of that is caught on camera, right? And domestic violence is never caught on camera. So we're able to just really completely ignore it.
Right. And it's opening up all of these questions about where violence comes from. And, just staying on the subject of the police, I can't help but notice when I'm seeing these clips on social media or in the news that I'm going to say actually all of the police officers who are acting with aggression toward protesters are men. And of course, this is not surprising because the American police force is only 12% female, and that number has been stagnant for the last 2 decades. It's a little better here in New York City. 17% of police officers here identify as female, but that's nowhere near the percentage in the UK, in Australia, and Canada. And I want to ask you, is it as simple as that? Do you think that an avenue toward police reform is changing the gender makeup of police?
It's an interesting question because right before, about an hour and a half ago, I read the amazing op-ed in today's New York Times by Michelle Alexander, and she talks a little bit about the diversifying of police forces. And of course, she's not talking just about gender. And she sort of has positioned that as like, that's not working. And I think to me, I agree with that. It's a step in the right direction, but it's not working well enough yet, right? Because the thing is, we have to change the culture. I mean, I did ride-alongs with police everywhere I went in this country, and sometimes I would go as a journalist, and then sometimes if they didn't want the press to go along, like here in Washington D.C., I would say, "Oh, well, I'm a professor at American University." Depended on which hat I needed to wear, right? But they always put me with like the liberal, white, young, hip cop, right? Like they don't put me with the cop who is the one who solves all the problems. Although one night in one jurisdiction, I was put with a woman, and it was her third night out, and she was like more nervous than I was. It was pretty crazy, but I think what you get is sort of regardless of gender is what is the culture of that police force and how is that being filtered down? In my book, I talk about a woman, a domestic violence high risk detective in Cleveland. And she is, in some ways, she's a typical cop, right? She talks like a cop. She's like kind of tough. She's always teasing me. She introduces me to everybody as Rachel. I hate the Cleveland police, Snyder, which is not true, but hilarious also. And I found her style of policing very, very different. And I asked her about it, and she was adamant, like, it's not because I'm a woman, it's because this is who I am. This is how I am. I disagree with her. I think it is partly how she is and the way in which she spends time and understands the complication of domestic violence. She goes to victims' houses rather than making them come into the sort of, off-putting bureaucracy that a police station, is a symbol of so often for a lot of people. So I think it's a start, but certainly just a start.
Fair enough. So let's just move from crisis to crisis. So from what's happening with police, domestic violence everywhere, from police brutality to coronavirus. And I'm thinking back to early March, Rachel, that's sort of those first few weeks of March where governments across the country were trying to acclimate us to the idea that the safest thing we could do was to stay at home. And I remember you being the first voice I heard that said, wait a second, people, home is actually the most dangerous place to be for many people, particularly women and children. And I want to ask you, was your warning right? What have you seen in your reporting in the last few months as to what people's experience has been being locked in?
Yeah. I'm gonna say yes. The reporting was right with a caveat that we actually are not sure because we're still like smack in the middle of that pandemic and people are still under varying kinds of stay-at-home orders. And even if they're in a state where there's not a stay-at-home order, I have many examples of COVID being used to control victims, but also to keep the police away. I spoke to a police chief who said he'd had officers go out to calls and have the primary aggressor, almost always the man, say, I have COVID, stay back, right? At the same time, you don't want to arrest someone and put them in a situation like jail, where there's outbreaks of COVID all over the country. It's a really complicated situation. Of course, shelters are often or can be hotbeds of COVID. The shelters that I spoke to that were still open, most of them, in fact, were still open, had increased their cleaning budgets by like 3 and 4 times. And so they were having huge financial problems at the same time that they were trying to combat this, at the same time that they had higher calls for service. So it's a sort of unbelievable constellation. And the other thing about this is we don't have homicide numbers for this period of time. We have certain cities that do better at tracking than others, or certain states. Milwaukee, for example, their homicide rate right now is more than double where it was this time last year. But we won't have homicide rates until like the fall of 2021. So we really won't have an accurate picture. But by most accounts, it's pretty bad, and it's pretty bad across the world.
Yeah, and I think what you say about impossible choices is right. Here in New York, in April, when we, was sort of peak of the pandemic for us, reports of domestic violence were down like 43%. And what I heard from many advocates is women would tell them, I don't want to make that impossible choice of sending my partner, my abuser, into a place where he can go get the virus. So I want to be safe, but I don't want that to happen to him.
Yeah.
So I think that this story still needs to be spun out. On a more positive note, though, it seems to me like during this time, a lot of really heroic people stepped up in law enforcement, service providers, people inside of the domestic violence world to try new things and to be creative in the ways that we could reach the women who are stuck at home with their abusers. And I wanted to ask you if you've seen any strategies that you think should become a permanent part of the domestic violence toolkit, or at least part of how we cope with, the waves that are to come of having to stay at home.
I do think that the question of putting somebody in prison or in jail for however, even a short period of time, that has been an ongoing question for some time in domestic violence circles, because a lot of people don't want the relationship to end. They just want the violence to stop, right? And so really what we have to ask ourselves is, well, what stops violence? And so, when we talk about domestic violence, I feel like what we talk about most of the time are the victim's stories. And so we're always talking about the after effects. And for me, I've been reporting for the New Yorker a story that's going to come out sometime soon. I'm not sure when. Next week, maybe. I don't know. It's at fact checking right now, just for the record. But on abusers intervention classes, many of them shut down immediately. If they were taking place in prisons, or in the wider community, they shut down. But for a lot of them, a good number of them went online. And what they're finding out is really incredible. I don't want to give like my whole story away, but what they're finding out is that Zoom really works for a lot of men who have had otherwise pretty big barriers to getting to a weekly class, right? Things like, getting money for bus fare, or navigating public transportation to get there on time when you might, your workday might end later, or, childcare issues, whatever it is. They're finding that for a lot of men, this is actually easier. And they're also finding that their participants are calling in. They're showing up. This has been sort of shocking across the country, that men who have been, in most cases, court ordered to go to abuser intervention classes have had that court order sort of continued during COVID, because if someone you can't really, make someone attend if they don't have the minutes on their phone, or they don't have an internet hookup at home, or whatever or their probation officer, his, or her office is closed. There's all kinds of those kinds of things happening. And yet these guys are still showing up. So I think that is information that we need to really look at when we come out of this period, and look at what we can do in our communities to change our paradigms.
I think that's so fascinating. And I wonder, Rachel, if maybe also being relieved of the shame of, going in person and being seen, in that program. I mean, it's something that you write about in the book, how you spend a lot of time on the men and on the perpetrators, and what that process is like for them to sort of come to a place of admission and accountability for themselves. And I wonder if that's something that can be done more readily in private.
I think so. And I think I've had a couple of different facilitators say, when they're in their own space, for a lot of them, they seem to be more comfortable, and they're joining from all over the place. I mean, they join from their laundry room, or wherever they can carve out a little bit of private space in their homes or in their cars, whatever, but they're in a place that's familiar. So for some of them, I mean, I don't want to say, my God, we've figured it out. We cracked the code. Like, we're not there. But I do think we have to expand our powers of imagination to what is possible and how we can change.
Yeah, and I think so much of the focus has been how to reach the women who are stuck at home, and this is in keeping with your book, that you're really talking about reaching all of the different actors and looking for a holistic solution.
Yeah, I think, I thought I don't know, I was worried when I was writing the book that, like, people would say you're giving too much, real estate to violent people who don't deserve it. And I had that. I mean, all writers have little voices in the back of their heads, some less helpful than others. But for me, I feel like we have to include those voices, and the the truth is that somebody who batters and somebody who is violent is also a person who has profound pain in their life. And I think you strip away that anger, and you get to, I mean, this isn't, researchers have talked about this for decades, that anger is just a cover for pain, right? And so some acknowledgement of that is gonna, I think, and I hope, move us past the sort of behavior analysis part of batterers.
Yeah. So you're frozen for a moment. Okay, there.
Am I?
Great.
Okay. You were frozen too. I was like, uh-oh.
I wasn't for the same reason. Okay, so let's
I freeze on the tough answers. I just go.
Oh, the Zoom conversation. Okay, so let's go back to this idea about impossible choices, because Rachel, I think a lot about, I worry a lot about underreporting in this space. I mean, you tell us in your book that probably less than half of all incidents of domestic violence are actually even being reported to the police. And then of the cases that are reported, there's this lack of cooperation, right? People don't want to work with the police and prosecutors. You say that it's as low as 20% in some jurisdictions. And there are so many reasons why people may not want to be a part of this process. So we've talked about this experience of women in COVID and not wanting to send their abusers into a place where they could get the virus. Or in Brooklyn, we often deal with women who are partnered with non-citizens, documented or undocumented. They don't want to trigger a process where that person is going to be deported. They want to be safe, but they don't want to unleash all of these consequences. If you report against a police officer who's abusing you, your family will, if he gets convicted of a crime, the whole family will lose the pension that the family might be depending on. And in thinking about these protests, I'm thinking about women who might not feel, if you don't feel like the system is fair, you're partnered with a person of color, you don't want to send him into a system that you think is unfair. So I want to ask you, help us. What can we do better to reach the people who don't want to be reached? And is the solution outside of law enforcement? Is that even the wrong paradigm to say, how can we bring them in?
Yeah. Well, okay, I'm going to try and give you a little bit of a long answer. I'll try and cut it down a bit, but this is a complicated question. And I'm so thrilled that you understand all those nuances, right? That for years we have had as the guiding philosophy of the sort of feminist domestic violence movement, something called the power and control wheel. It was created by a wonderful advocate named Ellen Pence back in the 80s that said, this is why abusers abuse, right? They want power and control and, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that power and control wheel is very, very helpful. I also think there is research now that suggests it's very, very white, right? That in fact, the dynamics in the home where there's abuse with people of color are very different than power and control. So I think these are really important conversations that we're just at the beginning of. And this is where I feel like this protest movement, and even people like me who I'm like, no, I'm woke. And then I'm like, wait, I could be more woke. I need to listen. I need to read more. I need to expand my understanding more. I think that the police, I don't think we can abolish the police as the protesters are sort of asking for right now, because they are necessary in domestic violence situations where the danger level is very, very high. But I do think we can do things, and you do this in Brooklyn, where you have one dedicated officer maybe on every shift who is the domestic violence officer, who has a domestic violence advocate in the car with her or in the car with him, so that it's not merely a law enforcement response. It is in fact a coordinated community response. I also, when I give talks, I say to domestic violence agencies, more women go to their clergy than to the police. So any training that you do absolutely should involve your community clergy. I think large workplaces need to have training on understanding the nuances. I think police get about, 2 hours, 4 hours, depends on the jurisdiction, of domestic violence training, or maybe a day if they're lucky. It's just not enough time. Right? And they need to understand why, when they pull up to a call, a victim might start screaming at them, right? Many of them don't understand that is a show of solidarity with an abuser, because those negotiations with the abuser are going to take place once that police officer is gone. You as an attorney would know this better than I do, but there is, or maybe not better than I do, but there is a lot of violence between arraignment and disposition, right? And so right now we're in this period where even if someone calls and their significant other gets arrested and then bails out and gets a court date that's 3 months in the future because the courts aren't fully functional right now. That is a very scary 3-month period. And the closer that court date looms, the higher that danger level goes up. That has got to be a problem that the whole community takes on, right? That we as neighbors can reach out to the people next door to us, the people who live in front and behind us, and say, I'm here if you need me. What can we do? How can we do this together? That's kind of a long answer. Here's the other thing I'll say. This is really short. It's a short thing that I'm trying to get this idea started. We already have this system of shelters, right? All across the US, we have more than 2,000 shelters. We know that mass incarceration is a problem, right? So let's not arrest people for, say, misdemeanor assaults in the 3rd degree. Let's put them in shelter and send all those women in shelters back home to their homes, right? So those guys who are in shelters can go to work and then they come home and they can have programming.
It's like a different kind of pretrial detention, right? And that's so interesting, Rachel. I want to talk to you a little bit more about that and push on that, because bail reform is, we're 2 years into working on bail reform in New York. It's so controversial. It's so difficult because on the one side, you say in your book that our best chance in domestic violence, and this is one of your conclusions, is that we have to disrupt at the misdemeanor phase. And you describe misdemeanors as the warning shots that could accelerate and intensify, into a homicide, into a murder. And you start and end the book with the stories of 2 murders, murder-suicides, and one's in Montana and one is across the country in New England. And I was struck by detail that these 2 cases had in common, which is in both of them, the abuser, who wound up being the murderer, was picked up on a misdemeanor charge and paid a $500 bail and got out right away. And in the first case in Montana, that's what you say led Michelle, the victim, to recant and to sort of fall apart, because she thought, okay, he's actually stronger than the system. And in the second case also, it took about a week from that moment until she was brutally murdered inside of her own house.
Right.
On the other hand, one of the tools we have for reducing mass incarceration is to stop putting people in jail for misdemeanors. And as of last year in New York, misdemeanor assault, which is the most common domestic violence charge, is no longer something that you go to jail for. You are at liberty before trial. And so this is a conflict, right? This is a conflict between how you describe how we can do best for domestic violence victims and how to take on mass incarceration. And I want to ask you to help us sort of get through that. This shelter idea, I think, is really interesting. Like, reconceive jail. Like, jail, we need the separation of jail without all of the things that we currently sort of associate with jail. Tell us from your reporting, who is doing this right? What should we be trying to do in balancing these 2 things?
Well, I don't think anybody's doing my shelter idea yet, but I'm going to keep yelling about it. Israel actually has a shelter. They don't call it a shelter, but they have something like this for men. I don't know what their success rates are. The first thing, of course, is recognizing the difference between jail and prison, right? And they're all in jail pre-trial, right? And so they're just being held there. I think one of the things that we have to do is separate out those cases that are potential high risk from ones that are not high risk. And we have the tools to do that. We have something called the danger assessment that allows us to do that. I think part of where the friction is that the world of law enforcement, including the judiciary, is event-based. And the world of domestic violence is a long, long, long story with a long tail. And so those 2 worlds have to come together somehow to create a sort of new way of looking at it. One tool is this danger assessment to try to figure out who is dangerous enough to be held pre-trial. Jail or prison, either one of them, are just incredibly disruptive. They're disruptive to the human spirit. Mm-hmm. Nobody gets out of jail or prison. Very, very few people, right? And we're not making investments in those programs where they might have that. I feel like if we do something that is different and we allow people to not disrupt their work life and maybe still see their kids while they're going through programming, it might be a new way to do it, right? I don't really know. I just think, I think we can't, to me, it's a mistake to have conversations about domestic violence without advocates of or proponents of ending mass incarceration sort of at the table with us, because how else are you gonna solve this? We're jailing people all over the place, you know.
So
I mean, it is disturbing. Sorry for interrupting. It is sort of disturbing that in New York you're not held at all, right? You're not even held for like a cooling off period, like 48 hours or whatever. That, if I was a victim, I would be very afraid, right? You're arrested and you're held just long enough to get even angrier. That seems to me a problem.
Those are the two cases that you describe in your book. But I think this is so fascinating that you describe the limitations of the criminal justice system as being caught up in the snapshot of that event in that moment. And so I guess I want to ask you, if there were like 5 things that you wanted everyone who works in this space, judges, prosecutors, police officers, to understand about domestic violence, what would those things be?
5 things. Okay. I think we need to understand, when we say, why doesn't she just leave, that the impetus for change should not be on the victim, number 1. Number 2, I think we need to understand the marker of potential homicide that strangulation is. And we need to be incorporating traumatic brain injury and strangulation protocols in every emergency room victim for somebody who is suspected of domestic violence abuse, in the same way that we do if you have a sports injury or a car accident. We already have those protocols for those 2 accidents, right? So all we need to do is include domestic violence victims in that. I would also include in that, can that be 2A, B, and C? I would also include police training on non-fatal strangulation and how to recognize it when it's not visible to the naked eye.
Have we made progress on that, Rachel?
We have made real progress on that. We really have. You know, what's funny is, because it took so long to research this book, I realized like there are real movements sort of working their way across the states right now. It's sort of like what rap was in the 90s, or hip hop in the 90s, where you had the West Coast and the East Coast, right? And on the East Coast, you have sort of the advent of what are called high risk teams, which are, you know, multi-conglomerate domestic violence teams that do try to separate out the high-risk cases and then build protections around the victims without having to take them out of their community. And then on the West Coast, you have like all the strangulation stuff that has come out and is like just moving its way across the country. And so I see these, I've done enough keynotes now for domestic violence agencies to see like where the emphasis is on in terms of their training. It's really interesting. And I think both those things really.
Let me interrupt you to say, I think you're being modest, because I think that you've done some of the work of weaving these strategies together.
I hope so. To me, they, like, every jurisdiction should be doing both of them. Absolutely, 100%. I don't know what number I'm on now. I feel like I've given, the other thing I would do is domestic violence training in schools for teenagers. And I would start around 7th or 8th grade. There are states like Texas, for example, where domestic violence education falls under sex education, and it's just not taught in schools. It's taught just 100% abstinence. That is not effective. That's not work.
Why so early? Is that because you think that already people are committing violence against each other in intimate situations at that age, or because you want them to understand what there is to come?
Because I want them to understand it. It's not me, it's really what the research says. The research says we need to be addressing this in middle school. You know, gender education and gender roles are established way before middle school. And if you look at both the two examples from my book that you brought up from New England and Montana, both those women were 14 when they met their eventual husbands who would kill them. 14 years old. That's a freshman in high school, right? So we need to be getting these kids before they stop listening to their parents, really. Listening to their teachers. So that's something I feel really, really strongly about.
And in fact, on the danger assessment that's used now all around the country, a relationship that starts when the victim is that young is a risk factor. It's one of the, the 22 odd signs that we
Yeah.
have.
Yeah. It's often things like a big age difference, as you saw with a bunch of different examples in my book. You might have a 10-year age difference. That youth is a risk factor, and really short courtships, right? Super intense relationships with both those relationships in my book had. So this kind of like love at first sight, this intense um, love that is also kind of talked about in like with morbid jealousy, as if it's a good thing. Like I talk in the I have a new afterword in my book where I've added some stuff, and one of the things I talk about is the movie with I think it's the
Twilight
series. Thank you. Yes, my pop culture is like, I'm getting older every day.
Got it. And it was.
Yeah, Robert Pattinson's character stands over Kristen Stewart watching her sleeping, and it's positioned culturally as this huge romantic gesture, when in actuality it's stalking, right? And we need to, maybe that's my fifth thing, is we need to change the cultural conversations that are happening. That's my task, right? That's my goal.
Right. I mean, we could go on. We're not going to turn into film critics here, but also he's from a culture of violence. I mean, he's a vampire. So
you know what? I've never seen the movies.
I've now confessed that I have. Tell us again a little bit more about that afterward, because you report a news story of domestic violence. This is coming out tomorrow, everybody, the paperback, with this new afterword, and it's just totally chilling. Tell us a little bit about it.
It was unbelievable. It's a year. The anniversary is right now. So I was in the middle of a book tour, the book tour for the hardcover of No Visible Bruises. And one of my dearest, oldest friends, who I've known for 25 years from Chicago, we're all from Chicago. Her brother killed his wife and then killed himself. And their older daughter was a very close friend of my daughter. It was the day of their 5th grade graduation. The couple who are dead were State Department people. Like I was just unprepared, and I don't think so. I wrote in the new afterwards. I sort of address it for the first time publicly. I mean, I talked to 2 reporters afterward, both of whom I knew and trusted, but then I didn't talk to anybody else. I canceled my book tour for a couple of weeks. It's still shocking to me. It's still really shocking to me. My friend from Chicago is living here in DC now, where I live, and is the guardian of her 2 nieces. And thankfully is also a really renowned therapist who's trained in childhood trauma. Their aunt, my friend. So these girls are going to be okay. But it underscored everything about my book, right? This can happen to anybody at any time. And we need to take away the shame and stigma of talking about how difficult it is, how painful it is, how the trauma just ripples for years.
What an extraordinary thing for you to say, that you were unprepared. I mean,
I was unprepared. And when I first heard, I was flying home. I had just done an event with Martina Latessa, the officer in Cleveland, and we went out to dinner and had this great evening. And then I flew home from Cleveland really early in the morning, and I was standing on the jetway when I got the call, and I just ran. I didn't even know why I was running, really. Like, the SWAT team was at the house, but I just ran. And my friend Michelle is her name, and I talk about her in the afterword. She just is different. She walks around the world differently today. No less beautiful and smart and wonderful, but she's a different like at the biochemical level or whatever, she's been altered somehow. And in fact, my daughter, for the first time ever yesterday, brought it up. We've been talking about it. It's the 1-year anniversary, and it was the first time she ever brought it up without me bringing it up. So these things, we just have to do better.
So we do. And I want to ask you, why are things getting worse and not better? And so you write that um, the homicides have gone up, domestic violence homicides have gone up 11% since 2014. I mean, it's hard to talk about, right? I've read even more staggering numbers that since 2017, they're up 33%. We've gone from 3 women a day to 4 women a day being killed by somebody in their family. And this is while Me Too is happening. And we're demanding that violence against women in the workplace, on college campuses, be taken more seriously. Why are things in this space worse and not better? And I want to ask you, Rachel, a question that's sort of connected to that and is going to go back to something you said about the visibility of domestic violence, which is, we're seeing right now this great American tradition of protesting and saying, we demand that things change. And it's undeniable to me that you are describing in your book an emergency. I don't even know what words to use, a crisis, a pandemic. In New York City, the police are responding to 250,000 domestic violence calls a year. Where's the movement?
Yeah. It's deeply, deeply heartbreaking to think about that. I think about that Women's March, for example, and what came out of it. I don't know that anything came out of it. I really don't. I'm sitting here talking to you. We have protests in all 50 states and in 18 countries, I think, at the last stat I read, which is incredible. And to me, moving in the right direction. And hopefully this will be real change. And Minneapolis is doing this big thing of kind of eradicating police and rethinking the paradigm. And that's awesome. But what about women? And I think right now we need to acknowledge that this is a moment for people of color and policing, and this is the Black Lives Matter moment. But man, do I want there to be a women's moment at some point soon. I mean, we have been fighting and fighting and fighting. Why is it up? Yes, it's up 33% in this country, but it's also up around the world. Every 15 minutes in South Africa, a woman is killed. Every 15 minutes. How long have I been talking to you? Right? 3 or 4 women have died in the time I've been talking to you. Pre-COVID numbers, 137 women a day. But of course, we don't have screenshots of this. We don't have video of women getting killed, more than 2,000 women a year in this country. If we had a dozen videos of that, maybe we would have more people out in the streets demanding change. Why is it happening? I do think that anytime there is a moment of civil unrest, you look historically at this country, you look at the civil rights movement or, suffrage or the union movement, and you've had a huge backlash. And we see a backlash now, but the difference to me is that we haven't had leadership normalizing that backlash in the way that we do now. And that's what's really scary. Until recently, I really was like, well, the progressive movements have won at all of those moments, right?
Yeah.
And that was very comforting to me for a long time, until it occurred to me that that's right. But we didn't have someone who is viably and validly accused of rape and sexual assault leading the free world and normalizing this kind of violence and this ugliness.
So I have to ask you before I turn it over to give us some hope. So I'm going to ask you before I turn it over to questions from the audience. Tell us
something. We're going to be invited to dinner parties once the world opens up again.
Hard stuff, right? Tell us the story that gives you hope or a strategy. Is it gun control? Is it different movements for
gun control, police movements? Yeah, I mean,
tell us about guns and domestic violence.
There are things that give me hope. I mean, one of the things, this maybe is going to sound self-serving, but one of the things that gives me hope is that I'm here at the New York Public Library. I'm not at a conference on domestic violence. Conferences on domestic violence are awesome and I love speaking at them, but I'm preaching to the choir there, right? I'm here with people who maybe don't real experience with domestic violence and don't care. So things like that do actually give me hope. The fact that, like, the New Yorker is regularly running stories of domestic violence now, not just by me, but by others, that's a real change, actually, right? The fact that when COVID hit, yeah, maybe I was the first one who said things are going to be bad for DV victims, but now those stories are everywhere. And so I do think that that is the beginning of change, but we need to keep the momentum going. And I think we're learning more. I think we're seeing, for example, that domestic violence victims with traumatic brain injury have the same neurological makeup as prisoners of war. Right. That is information that we can use to make programmatic changes. So, inch by inch, what did Gandhi say? Like, you got to plant the seeds, not for your generation, but for the next one.
Next one. Yeah, I think you've planted a lot of seeds. So I'm gonna lean in now, Rachel. I'm just gonna look at this chat. We have lots of questions from the audience. I'm going to start with this one. So someone is saying your comment about power and control as a white construct is interesting, the power and control wheel that you talked about and the assumptions that went into it. Could you say more about different dynamics in play in households of color compared to white households? And you might just want to more broadly talk about different sorts of abuse and power structures that you've seen.
It's a great question, and I'll tell you, it's something that I didn't fully really hear about until very recently. Actually, I remember thinking, like, the power and control wheel seems, I don't know, too tidy, right, for a situation that is actually very complex. But so the researcher who told me this just fairly recently said, when you have conversations with Black women about this, they don't feel like they don't have power. They feel like they have power, but they're still getting beaten up, right? They're still getting abused and whatever. So it's not the same. They don't have the same language for it. When you are, I lived in Asia for 6 years. So there's a lot of cultural conversations around the difference, for example, between Westerners and Asians, and the ways in which you move around the world and the expectations of home and things like that. And, in places like, Afghanistan, for example, it is often the mother-in-law who perpetrates the violence against the daughter-in-law, but it's at her son's or, the husband's request, right? So there's this like gender dynamic in there. So I feel like, the power and control wheel is helpful but limited, and I don't know what the next component of that conversation is, because we've barely had that conversation, or at least barely had it in a more comprehensive national way that is much more inclusive.
Right. But, in my experience, there are a lot of nonprofits around New York City's, smaller organizations that are very culturally specific in how they talk about domestic violence in different communities. And that's a big, part of their success, is that they're able to sort of adjust and say, well, this is how it's done, in your world. And let us do that.
Well, and also you have to think, like, when you're talking about, like, for example, I interviewed a woman who runs an abusers intervention program in Milwaukee, and most of her the men in her program are on the economic fringes, and most of them are minorities. And she said these are not men who would relate to the power and control wheel, because they are experiencing a system that has such power over them, right? The law enforcement system, the probation and parole and prison and all that kind of stuff, the men in her group, which I just think is a paradigm shift in our thinking.
Yeah, and a diversification in our thinking. So Rachel, now we have a more personal question for you. Someone is asking, what is the emotional fortitude you had or had to acquire to sustain your reporting on this over such a long period of time? Were there ever moments when you felt like the work was too much?
Oh my gosh. I don't know why I did this one day, but I was writing a scene. I know exactly the scene it was. It was in part 3 of my book. And I was writing about, you talked about the woman in New England who was killed. And her daughter, who I believe was 11 at the time, was the one who called 911. then she went under her bed, hid. And she hear on the 911 call, her father shoot her mother and then shoot himself. And I've listened to this 911 call a bunch of times. And like just been like, okay, it's the 911 call. But when I went to write the scene, I was sitting on my couch in my writing room. I handwrite everything. I don't compose on computer. And I just started to sob. And I don't know why I did this, but I took a picture, a selfie, and sent it to two researchers that I've become very like dear friends with through the course of 10 years of researching this, and said, does this ever happen to you when you're writing this? I take steps away when I need to. In fact, I'm about to take like 2 months off of researching this because I feel I need to. I take time off. I walk my dog. I try to eat healthy. I have terrible sleep. I am not a paragon of mental health. It definitely affects me, but I also read a lot of poetry. I find poetry just sort of, I don't know, like it speaks to my soul and heals me in some way. For some people, that's maybe just watching a movie and decompressing or something. For me, it's poetry. In fact, I wrote this book in like 5 months. I researched it forever and then wrote it in just like a frenzy. And I, during the writing of it, read nothing but poetry. I couldn't hold a narrative in my head.
I mean, I would think that your description of how to cope with this kind of trauma is important for the people who are experiencing it firsthand, secondhand, thirdhand. So,
this is something when we talk about police, by the way, that we don't acknowledge how hard it is for them to see the things they see and have no like emotional interventions in a lot of police departments. So I actually think that like we all need to be talking about the kind of vicarious trauma of this kind of work all the time. Also, this is just straight gin. No, I'm kidding. It's not.
Cheers, Rachel. So we do have another question about the police. This is sort of a question about the defunding the police. And someone is asking, with talks of police reform at a fever pitch right now, do you think having more mental health experts or social workers on staff to go out on calls with the officers would help?
Yes, I do. Although I'm not 100% sure that police are the ones who should be getting all those calls in the first place. Like, should police be getting mental health calls? Like, I don't know. It doesn't seem like it, right? I mean, my instinct is to say yes, but I'm just not sure. I feel like we need different ways of thinking about community interventions, right? I mean, we have a suicide hotline. So are police the best people to call when, someone says, I'm afraid that my, husband is going to commit suicide, or I'm afraid my son who's, in a dorm room, blah, 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 somewhere is going to commit suicide. Like, it seems to me like we might want to have a mental health response line with personnel that go out to those calls that are not law enforcement at all.
Someone is asking yet another question on this subject, which is, you said that you do think the police are necessary to be present in cases where the abuser's likelihood of great violence is likely. So then the high risk cases. Have you seen any, this is another question about cultural specificity also in a way, have you seen any communal responses to those extreme cases other than police? So tell us about community interventions that have worked.
Yeah. Let me think about that. That's a really good question. Have I seen I mean, like, I think the high risk team movement is in some sense answering that call, right? So the high risk teams started in New England. They started as a result of this murder that I read about in the book. Mm-hmm. And they are made up usually of a vast constellation of different service organizations. So they'll have domestic violence advocates. The good ones have domestic violence advocates kind of leading the meetings. Mm-hmm. And they have police and or detectives. They have healthcare workers or hospital liaisons. They have abusers intervention group representatives. They have uh, service providers. They have, in the good ones, they have child protection agencies, they have prosecutors or DAs. So there's a vast, and some of them have clergy. There's a vast array of people kind of seated at the table. And they all come in with like, look, someone came to me and, we're worried about this or that. And they kind of determine based on this danger assessment and their discussions, who is high risk. And then they try to build protections around the victim and the family, right? And some of those protections might be, this is where the bail reform is so important, might be holding that abuser pre-trial in really, really high risk situations. Some of them might be taking guns away from somebody who is charged with a domestic violence crime. In Texas, I spoke to a woman who the police actually came out and installed security cameras around her house, and they're doing extra drive-bys in this. She lives outside of Austin, Texas, so in that community. To me, those are all effective ways of using the community resources.
And I think I have time to give you one more question from the audience. This is a more personal question about our own responsibilities in our communities. So someone is saying, what should you do if you know someone who is an abuser and won't get assistance, and the victim is in danger and won't go for help? Should you change your relationship to those people? Should you contact the police? Should you threaten to tell the employer or something else?
That's a really tough question that I get asked a lot. In fact, I'll never forget the day I was standing in a ballroom in Georgia, speaking to like 200 people, and a woman stood up and said, I can't go home right now. What should I do?
Yeah.
I was like, there's got to be domestic violence advocates in this room of 200. And of course there were lawyers, and they just surrounded her. It was really beautiful and a stunning thing to see. Part of it depends on your relationship to that person and to her various outreach, programs. You might, if she goes to church, you might talk to clergy. If she has siblings, you might talk to siblings. I mean, one of the things that I found researching this book was families get tired of intervening because they feel like, well, that, their sister never leaves. They've told her to leave 1,000 times and she doesn't leave. And then when something happens, like she winds up getting killed, they feel terribly, terribly guilty. So one of the things I tried to do in my book was help people to understand why people don't leave. And I think the thing that you have to look at, or that the questioner has to look at, is what are the complicating factors of why she isn't leaving and why he refuses to acknowledge, right? We talked a lot about bad risk intervention and what works. One thing I'll say is it only works if an abuser wants to change. Just like Alcoholics Anonymous only works if someone wants to stop being an alcoholic, right? Number one, they have to really want to change. I would actually do a danger assessment. You can find the danger assessment on the danger assessment website. Just type in danger assessment. And you can look at the 22 high risk factors and try to begin to answer that for your friend to get a sense of her level of dangerousness. The other thing that you can ask her to do, if she's willing to talk a little bit about it, is have her do a timeline, just putting an X where events have happened, because you want her to come to the realization of her own level of dangerousness. It can't be like you telling her. One of the things I think the Me Too movement has been really helpful for is giving us a roadmap to talk about difficult situations. And I think COVID is even making that in some ways more approachable, to be able to say to my neighbors, hey, we don't know each other that well, but I'm here if you need anything at all, and just start the conversation without shame and without confrontation and without blame. And people, it will take a while, but people will usually eventually begin to talk. I hope that's helpful advice.
And Rachel, the only thing I would add to that is your insight that, remember, leaving is a process. And so, it will take many iterations often to sort of get somebody to safety. And the sort of the process is built into that question. So I want first and foremost to thank you for writing this book, and just to say to everybody, it's also a really wonderful book. I think it's required reading to sort of help us solve this problem, but also is really in its own way a pleasure to read, really. And go and get the paperback tomorrow. Thank you for all of you for joining us tonight. If you or someone you know is experiencing domestic violence, we're going to put up some resources on the screen, and you saw them before you came in as well. Good night, everyone.
Thank you. And thank you so much, New York Public Library. Mwah!
Thank you.